there, art nerds! Today we are talking about Marie's master level watercolors. These little tubes of Western style watercolor caught my interest because I have reviewed several different Marie's products here on the channel over the years, and since we've been talking about Chinese watercolors with a more Western art style in mind, I thought this would be a perfect fit. We have talked about Mei-Liang pigments. We have talked about Turner Japanesque, which not Chinese, Japanese, but along the same sort of theme here. And we have also talked about Art Whale / Superior watercolors. So I figured if you guys are on the market for affordable watercolors, these might be a good fit for you. You ever think you know a company and then they release something that maybe takes you by surprise and you just have to find out if it's any good, if it holds up to the company's standards, or perhaps if it exceeds the company's standards? Well, today's review is hopefully going to exceed the company's standards, but I just could not resist. Today, we're taking a look at Marie's Masters watercolors. Now, on the front it says Masters, on the back it says Marie's. We have looked at Marie's Chinese watercolors, their professional Chinese watercolors, and their Western style watercolors here on the channel a long time ago. So it's been a while. There's been a lot of competition in the Chinese manufacturer watercolor sphere, and I am hopeful that we might be on to something good. So right here, I have several of some of them are their single pigment colors, and then some of them are like pearl sapphire blue, pearl bluish green. So we've got 4 single pigment colors, all in shades of blue and teal, 2 pearlescent colors, and then let's find out what we have inside this box here. In addition to the 4 single pigment colors and the 2 pearlescent colors, which might also be included in this set, they were separate Amazon listings and they were fulfilled by Jerry's Artorama, but they may be duplicates. I also have the 24 color Masters watercolors, and this is what is contained in the 24 color box. We have white, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow hue, cadmium orange hue, cadmium red hue, alizarin crimson, permanent rose, crimson, purple red, emerald green, sap green, viridian, phthalo green, brilliant purple, sky blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine, Prussian blue, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, raw umber, Payne's gray, and ivory black. And this is for 0 to 3 Sad Onion Children, and it is wrapped in a cardboard, fairly thin actually, cardboard package, and it is in there really tight. So for the curious, I already see 1 duplicate here. I see another duplicate here. These are definitely not in that set, the 2 pearlescents. I see a 3rd duplicate here, and then this is not in that set. So of the 3 of the 6 colors that I purchased from like a single pigment listing, and I'll bring that up for you guys, are all already duplicated in the 24 color set. So the more you know, hopefully you don't have to buy it. What are we accomplishing today, Pinky? Well, in YouTube terms, we are going to unbox these. We're going to decant them into half pans. We're going to swatch them while they're still wet. We're going to let them dry for a week. We're going to come back. We're going to re-wet them. We're going to re-swatch them. Then we're going to do our color mixing test and our wet into wet test. And if all goes well, it may take us another 2 weeks, but we'll also complete a field test. But all of that will be in the magic of YouTube, so it'll be like an hour and a half-ish. For me, realistically, what I'm going to get done today is I am going to unbox this, swatch these, and let them dry. So let's go ahead and get cracking. These kind of reviews do take a long amount of time to kind of work on them. There's a lot of waiting, but they also take a lot of just time in general to do them. So the sooner I can dive into this, the sooner we can make some progress. If you are new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Becca Hilburn. I am a watercolor artist and comic artist. I paint the Watercolor Comics 7-inch Cara, which you can read for free at 7inchcara.com. Or if you happen to love books as much as I do, you can order your own copies of Volume 1 and Volume 2 in the Natto Shop at nattosoup.com/shop. I have been painting with watercolor for over 15 years now, and I review watercolors as a hobby. And I have reviewed so many student grade and professional grade watercolors here on the channel over the years. And that has really given me a lot of experience with watercolor and what watercolors I like and what properties I'm looking for and what price points I'm comfortable with and the differences between how a student grade paint handles and a professional grade paint handles. And as I mentioned earlier, we have talked about Marie's in the past. I reviewed their Chinese watercolors. I reviewed their Western watercolors and did not really like them that much at the time. And I've reviewed their professional Chinese watercolors and did a Western style watercolor painting with them, and I really like them. Now, that is not the intended use case, but I really like them. So I have middling hopes today that I might actually really like these. Now, these might be another Chinese brand that's currently being white labeled by Marie's. Not that I have any hard and fast information about that, but it's really not uncommon. And Marie's really has released a few of their less expensive palettes that are also like Jerry Q palettes or sold by Jerry's Artorama under their Creative Mark line. So like there's a lot of white labeling that tends to go on anyway. So I'm going to see if I can dig up information about that as well. If you know something I don't know though, and you want to share it in the comments below, that would be a huge help as well, because when it comes to some of these watercolor brands, it can be really difficult to get to the bottom of things. Like, for example, Winsor & Newton's student grade line is Cotman. Cotman is currently white labeling Phoenix watercolors for their line. So they're not actually being manufactured by Winsor & Newton. They're being subcontracted to another brand. And I think it's important to know who's buying from who for a lot of reasons. Ethical reasons in terms of like perhaps there are labor practices that you don't want to support. This will help you figure out which companies might be breaking those labor practices. For quality control practices, some countries prefer one binder over another or may have a different use case for their watercolors and they may be created differently, and you might not paint that way and you might not like how those paints actually handle. Sometimes student grade products are being sold as professional grade products. So there's a price discrepancy where you're paying a lot more for a product that isn't really that good. So there's a lot of reasons why we might want to know who's actually originally manufacturing these watercolors. Now, this is their master line, and in the US, I don't really know that there is like, there's student grade and there's professional grade, and they have what I call children's grade. So like Crayola, Prang, and that's just like very glycerin-based watercolors that are designed to be more washable. Lots of adults use those. I just call them children's grade to differentiate them from student grade. We don't necessarily have like a master's grade delineation. So this may mean something. It may mean professional grade. It may not mean anything. It could just be an adjective to make them stand out more. So we're going to be finding out a lot today, but I did notice there's a lot of hues in this set, and typically, but not always, professional grade watercolors do not include as many hues. That said, Winsor & Newton is kind of trying to move away from the cadmiums. So that means a lot of the colors replicating those cadmium colors would be like hue colors. So there might be a rationale behind it, a thought process that explains why there's so many hues. Here is our something. This is made by Shanghai Marie Painting Materials Co. Limited. I think this is like the quality control slip, but you guys, if you know different, let me know. These are 9 milliliter metal tubes. They're also 0.3 US fluid ounces. They are kind of textured. They feel kind of good, and they have a plastic band around them. Honestly, underneath this adhesive band is probably the Chinese version of the same information. They have a little twist top. These are not ointment tubes. They are just straight up paint tubes. The next step is for us to decant these into half pans. And the way I have been doing my unbox and swatch reviews lately is I purchased these little metal tins off of Amazon. I have these open stock half pans and I have these magnets. And I find that this is a less expensive way to keep my, basically what I do when I'm reviewing art supplies is I will have like a palette of those watercolors all together. I don't add any other brands. I try to keep the base colors all together, and that allows me to pull them out again to talk about them in later reviews. So I don't really know what to call that. It's like my sample, right? Now, if I really love a color, it'll go into my Daily Driver watercolor palette. But generally, I try to keep these from being mixed in with those so that I always know what brand is in that palette, and I always know what colors are in that palette because I keep them in the order that they were in the boxes. And I like to decant into half pans because that's how I do most of my watercolor painting, is from dried half pans. So it's important for me to be able to test whether or not they'll reconstitute. So each tube has the color number, the color name, I assume this is the light fast information, and then the pigment information. And I will transpose all of this for you guys. It'll either be in the description or in the show notes that I will link in the description, depending on how long this gets. Then on the back, it also has a W, well, they all have the same number, W1009. Yeah, I read that correctly. Sorry about that. I guess it's 1009. Come on, Becca. And these are Shanghai Marie Painting Materials Co. Limited. And apparently this company has been around since 1818 or 1819. It's kind of hard to read on the tiny little metal tube. The colors in this set are 102 white, 215 lemon yellow, 213 cadmium yellow hue, 320 cadmium orange hue, 328 cadmium red hue, 403 purple red, 364 permanent rose, 315 crimson, 344 alizarin crimson, 559 emerald green, 568 sap green, 560 viridian, 558 phthalo green, 402 brilliant purple, 447 sky blue, 453 cobalt blue, 443 ultramarine, 445 Prussian blue, 676 yellow ochre, 684 burnt sienna, 687 burnt umber, 688 raw umber, 797 Payne's gray, and 792 ivory black. Light fast information and pigment information will be in the show notes below. These are all potted up. They were a little more liquidy than I expected, kind of reminded me of the Mei Liang Pigments watercolors. If they are anything like the Mei Liang Pigments watercolors, it'll be really interesting to see how much these shrink. If at some point in the future you want to see me compare a bunch of Chinese brand, like the Chinese tube brands, so Superior, Mei Liang, maybe Paul Rubens, and Marie's, let me know. Not doing that one today, but I'm open to the idea in the future. So the only one where I noticed significant separation is the one that happened to spill. And that gum Arabic is really kind of a loose gum Arabic. Now, with the Mei Liangs, we saw significant paint evaporation, like a lot of movement. However, it didn't really change the qualities of the paint. They still reactivated very easily. They were a joy to paint with. They delivered bright and vibrant color. I am hoping to see the same with the Maries. So next, it's time to pull out our cotton rag paper and get to swatching. So what are we swatching on today? The same thing we always swatch on. We're going to be swatching on Blick Studio cotton rag watercolor paper. It is a block bound watercolor paper. And I am hoping to get 2 sets of swatches on this paper. Today's swatches and then the swatches that I'm going to re-swatch a week from now so we have everything on one piece of paper for handy comparison. Cross your fingers for me, guys. I think we can do it. I believe in us. I want to test granulation, opacity, coverage. There's some other things I'm going to be looking for, but I don't yet have like a great name for them. Like with dye-based watercolors where you try to do a wash and it just rushes to fill the wash. Kind of looking for that as well. Maybe looking for some flocculation or scaling. That said, I usually only start to see that when we do some color mixing and some wet into wet. So probably won't see any major problems today. Probably will see some issues with color control, and that's because these are very liquidy watercolors. They're not as solid as some of the ones that I've taken a look at in the past, but I hope that they'll set up okay and that liquidity will not be a problem. While filling the half pans, I noticed that the colors are very liquidy and remind me of how liquidy the Mei-Liang pigment tubes were. Those had significant drying and evaporation, but still reactivated and performed well, so these being really liquidy isn't necessarily a huge problem in and of itself, but it does point to these being more on the student grade spectrum than professional or master level. The colors are fairly vibrant in the half pan, and I wonder how much evaporation and cracking we'll see. Color saturation reminds me of the Art Whale / Superior watercolors in their tube to half pan form. While swatching, the color control is a bit tricky as these do want to glob up on my brush and would maybe benefit from a bit of mixing. My friends who like to work straight from the tube, you might want to set these up on a ceramic palette and let them dry a bit before using them. I did notice some weird streaky particles in some of the colors. I'm not sure if this is because they didn't dissolve properly, and it may sort itself out as I allow these to dry in half pans, or if I didn't mix them well enough, and it might resolve itself with a mixing palette. But it does mean that if you're painting with these straight from the tube, you may be disappointed with how some of the colors handle. I also noticed that many colors do flood the wash, so we're not really getting a true gradient. I did have some color control issues. 0% surprised. These will probably handle a little bit better after they've had a chance to dry out. If you're one of my friends who prefers to work straight from the tube and you like to work on a big ceramic palette, maybe what you could do is dab them out and then let them dry by a fan for about an hour just to kind of thicken up a little bit because they are very, very liquidy. Now, something I noticed, and I don't know if this is from the, them still being so wet problem or what, is I'm getting a weird sort of particle dispersal. Like you see those little chunkies and you see the chunkies there and you see the chunkies in these two. Actually, let me bring the camera to y'all. So you see what I mean? Like with the weird particles. And I'm not sure if that is from the tube still being wet. Like if that's going to be, I'm not sure if once they've had a chance to dry, they're going to all reactivate evenly. So we're not going to get chunks, or, if that is going to be a continued problem. But that's one of the reasons we are going to re-swatch after they've had a chance to dry. Now, these three colors here are the three not in the 24 color set colors, Peacock Blue, and our two pearlescents. I'm seeing like a little bit of pearlescence, but not a lot of coverage. I'm really hoping that's going to improve after these have a chance to dry out as well. It's been about a week since I potted these Marie's watercolors. They are fairly dry. There has been some cracking. There's been a good amount of evaporation, but it isn't as extreme as the Mei-Liang where they really dip down. This is probably a pretty normal amount. So that means it is time for us to re-swatch these and test their activation. It also means it's time for us to do our color mixing and our wet into wet test. And hopefully we can even comparison swatch against these older Marie's Western style watercolors that I have. And I may, just for your reference, not because it's particularly similar, re-swatch my Marie's professional Chinese watercolors for you guys as well. Marie's is a Chinese watercolor company that's been manufacturing watercolor and paint supplies for the Chinese market for over 105 years. They offer a variety of art supplies, including oil paints, watercolor, and gouache. You can find Marie's on Amazon as well as on Jerry's Autorama. I believe that Jerry's is fulfilling Amazon orders, at least that's what I saw here. I have already reviewed the Marie's Economy Chinese watercolors. I've reviewed the Marie's Western watercolors, and I did a comparison between their Chinese and their Western watercolors. I've also reviewed their professional watercolors and put them to the field test. So what we're looking at is Jerry's claims that Marie's Painting Material Factory has more than 100 years of experience making vivid watercolors. Their reputation for quality continues today, and many great artists use Marie's watercolors on their palette. Each tube of Master's quality watercolor contains the finest pigments balanced by a quality binder. Intensely pigmented and light fast, the paint performs flawlessly on paper. Marie's uses old and new paint making techniques to guarantee that Master's watercolors meets the needs of professional artists. Now you can add the brilliance of Master's finest quality watercolors to your art. So these are some of their older sets. Here is their Masters. Here is the professional watercolor. This is what I just read to you guys. These are available in sets of 12, 18, 24, and then they are also available open stock. And you guys can see they're rather budget priced. The key features, according to Jerry's, are they have a range of 55 billion colors in 9mm tubes. They're available in sets of 12, 18, and 24. Several single pigment shades, includes 4 metallic and 7 pearlescent colors, finest pure pigments, highest light fastness ratings, highly concentrated color, stands nicely on watercolor paper. And Jerry's claims that it is perfect for professional watercolorists, beginning watercolors, beautifully clean color mixing, permanent professional works of art, free-flowing, vivid watercolor painting. So let's check out the official Marie's site. Here is their English website, and just because they have products listed, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily available in the US, which is kind of disappointing because some of the products under their watercolor line are really intriguing, and I'd love to give them a closer look. You guys can also check out, I have a bunch of links down in the show notes that include more information about Marie's as a company, but they produce oil, acrylic, gouache, poster paint, and watercolor. They also have some products that look like they might be Jerry Q or Superior branded, and it makes me kind of wondering if there's some cross-company white labeling going on. I'll show you guys the Superior lookalikes and the Jerry Q lookalikes as well. And they have some beautiful Chinese watercolor sets, more than just the 2 that I've talked about, and I wish those were a little more accessible in the US because I would love to get a look at them. So let's take a pretty quick look at their products. You guys can see they have the sections kind of broken down over here. And then here is just kind of everything they offer. And they offer a lot because Marie's is one of the big producers of Chinese art supplies for the Chinese market. And they've been available in the US for a while, but they've been kind of quiet about it. So they do also have a gouache line, including the little jelly pot gouaches. As well as more higher end looking gouache sets like these. They have Chinese painting supplies, which I've mentioned on the channel before. I really want to learn more about Chinese watercolor and Chinese painting. But you guys can see these are some of the interesting, this one in particular, with the beautiful halo bleed effect. And then some of these sets are just very pretty. And then the set that you guys have seen me talk about, and probably the set that you guys have seen around. And they also carry watercolors. Now, my experience with Marie's Watercolor is this is a brand that used to be really commonly available when I was a girl. Like David's carried it, Walmart sometimes had it, Michael's had it. You don't see it around as much, but you can find it through Jerry's Artorama. And what I thought of it as growing up was I thought of it as kind of like a budget brand similar to Reeves. Now, I've had some experiences as an adult that still make me feel like some of the offerings that we have here are comparable to Reeves, but I've also had some really good experiences with their professional watercolors. These are the ones that make me think of Superior. This is that folding palette, and then this is that fan style palette, and then this is what makes me think of the Jerry Q. And it really makes me wonder how much white labeling is going on with this company. Quickly, before we go back to the tabletop, I did actually want to kind of read over their brand history and culture. Some of this does kind of feel a little propaganda-y, so we're going to take some of it with a grain of salt, but I do still think it's interesting since this is a brand that isn't US based and we're not as familiar with their history. Shanghai Marie Painting Materials Co. Limited is a professional production and operation enterprise with a century-old history of art, painting, and various supporting painting materials in China. The Marie's brand is a classic brand that has been established for over 100 years and is a national brand among art products in China. The Marie Art Pigment trademark is one of the first famous trademarks in Shanghai. Since 1995, it has been awarded the title of Shanghai Famous Brand Product for several consecutive sessions. It has been recognized as a Chinese time-honored brand by the Ministry of Commerce and is one of the most promising old trademark enterprises in Shanghai by the Shanghai Administration for Industry and Commerce. On June 7, 2018, the Marie brand of traditional Chinese painting received the first batch of Shanghai brand certification. Through continuous technological innovation, Marie products have formed a series of product structures mainly focused on professional and educational products, divided into more than 10 major categories and over 2,500 varieties. With people's increasing demand for cultural life and fashion personality in recent years, Marie products have also entered the fashion leisure category and cross-border products. Mr. Chen Yifu, a famous Chinese painter, once said, "The history of Marie's development is an indispensable part of modern Chinese art history. Marie growth is closely related to the prosperity and development of China's art industry." And I think that's really cool and really interesting that this particular brand seems to have had a really big impact on one culture's current art history. I know China has had a really long history of art and culture, so I'm not trying to claim like, oh, Marie's is where Chinese art culture came about, but I do think it's very cool that it is so tied with where they are currently art-wise. In 1919, Mr. Zhang Yonggang, a famous painter and one of the founders of Shanghai Chinese Art College, along with 9 other painters and entrepreneurs, decided to pioneer the national pigments industry out of their strong patriotic ardor. They raised funds to run a factory to produce China's own art paints. But what name should they give to the factory? In order to show the determination to work as one, 10 shareholders first chose the traditional Chinese this with 10 strokes, meaning an instant success. And then they chose the traditional Chinese, meaning benefiting the nation and the people. So Marie Art Factory came into existence. From then on, the tempera with a circular horse's head pattern began its pioneering course to carry forward the national integrity and develop a national industry. And here we go. And it became a registered trademark in 1934. Now, part of what makes me think this is so interesting is we have talked a lot about Chinese watercolors here on the channel in the past few years. We've talked a lot about Paul Rubens. We've talked a lot about Superior. In our explorations of AliExpress, we've had the chance to check out a bunch of different brands. But most of those are not as established as Marie's, while some of them have quite interesting goals like Paul Rubens and might even be a competitor with Marie's. They don't have as much history and it isn't in English. So it isn't easy for me to like look at this with you guys and talk about it with you guys. But because Marie's has had kind of a place in the US market for a while and has been available since the 90s, it does have more English information available. So I thought it was kind of neat to like look at Marie's in the context of Chinese watercolors and the kind of watercolors that we've been talking about here on the channel.
after a week of drying, I noticed that these reactivated easily, and these might be a little less saturated than they were straight from the tube, but less saturated than many of the other Chinese watercolor brands that I've tried. None of those weird particles and we saw in the straight from the tube are appearing in the half pans, so it seems like letting them dry kind of helps solve some of the issues we were seeing previously. These might be a better set to set up in half pans, let dry, and then reconstitute, rather than trying to work with them directly from the tube.
These were quick to reactivate, fairly saturated, and I'm not getting the weird kind of flocculation or speckling that I got with some of the colors. I say saturated, maybe not as saturated as some of the other brands like Superior, Mailing, Paul Rubens. Now that I'm looking at it, they're a little bit dull. I don't know, the truth will reveal itself, I feel. I am very interested, I think I probably mentioned this, in doing a multi-brand test on Chinese, and then one on Korean, and then one on Japanese watercolors. So it'll be really interesting to go head to head with some of these and see how all that shakes out, because sometimes you're just having a weird swatching day. So next, I want to do some color mixing, and I'm just picking off some of the paints that dried and had stuck to the lid. I can just kind of remelt them back in with the paints they came from, so not a big deal. Let's do some color mixing.
Color mixing was fairly unexceptional. These are able to mix decent secondary colors that go down very saturated and vibrant, and dry a little less saturated, but that's to be expected with watercolor in general. I was able to mix vibrant oranges, greens, decent purples, pretty much what you want to see from these kind of secondary color mixes.
Mixing is pretty easy. It's easy to make some good secondary colors for the most part, and colors are mostly pretty vibrant. There is some noticeable granulation in some of these mixes, which makes sense. Some of these have a base with ultramarine blue. There might be a little bit of scaling. It's kind of hard to tell at this stage, but it's noticeable, but not as, I don't know. It's one of those things where I feel like we're really going to be able to tell from the wet into wet test how much scaling we're going to get with these. So I don't necessarily want to say right now. Next, we are going to do the lift test, and I am going to lift both the colors that had a week to dry, as well as the colors that we did today.
I found that these were surprisingly not very lifting. Not very lifting with the old swatches that had more than a week to dry, and not very lifting with the newer swatches, which had far less time to dry out.
These are surprisingly not lifting. Like, I really thought these were gonna pick up, and once they are down, it seems like they are really on the paper, which doesn't always bode well for some watercolor techniques, but bodes really well for others. It's just one of those sort of things where you really have to kind of know it's gonna do that, so you can tailor what you're doing with these to suit that, or save these for projects where, for example, you really want like a lot of layering and a lot of glazing and you don't want reactivation. So next, it's time for the proof to be in the pudding. We're going to do the wet into wet test. Chinese watercolor brand, Chinese watercolor paper. We're going to do our field test today, or not our field test, our wet into wet test today, our mud test on the Bao Hang 100% cotton watercolor paper. I did the Mei Liang wet into wet test on this paper as well, so at least that'll be pretty comparable. Usually I do it on the Blick, but this will work just as well for today. And honestly, we're probably going to be field testing these paints in this video anyway.
I was able to build up some good saturation and saw some interesting and pretty color diffusion with the wet into wet test. It will be really interesting to see how these dry. Now, I did see some strange effects that I can't quite explain with these. Hopefully, you guys will see what I'm talking about. With the hyperlapse drawing, you guys can see we didn't really lose a whole lot of saturation as these colors dried out.
This is surface level dry. It's not all the way dry, but I'm really surprised by how saturated many of those colors remain. And we've also got some interesting things going on. We've got some, it's weird how some of these colors self-isolated, and we've got some like interesting particle things going on, and we've got some like kind of strange for that color flocculation, but then we have some really pretty wet into wet diffusal. I am not seeing any haloing yet, and it's hard to tell if what some of this is going on is scaling or like over here, right? Like that's kind of weird. I haven't really seen anything like that. So I'm not really sure what to make of it, but let's go ahead and move on to comparing the older Western style Marie's watercolors to our newer Masters colors. So here are the older tubes. They are in ointment style tubes in a fairly inexpensive plastic liner. This says, Marie's watercolors are made in aluminum tubes, which are the latest painting color packaging materials in the international market. Using aluminum tube with a beautiful and colorful exterior in a special, non-leaded, toxic, and will not pose chronic adverse health effects in humans when the colors are used as intended. After being reviewed by certified toxologists, this product conforms to ASTM D4236 and EN71. For over 70 years, Marie's have used the finest materials in the manufacture of their watercolors to assure you accuracy of shade and transparency. The materials used are non-toxic and are mixed in proportion with refined gum, making them easily dissolvable in water for effortless mixing and washes. For your and your children's good health, using Marie's watercolors made in aluminum tubes is the best choice. How old is it? When did I buy this pack? I know I bought it a few years ago, but like, how old is this? I don't know, because they just had their 106th birthday, or they're about to have their 106th birthday, and they did say for over 70 years. But you would think if they had hit another milestone, and this were newer packaging, it might say over 80 years or over 90 years. I don't know. So I don't really want to swatch these straight from the tube. What I kind of want to do is this is an 18 color set. So I want to dig up a watercolor well, palette that has 18 wells, and that'll give us like a little bit of a chance to kind of mix the colors and swatch them a little bit more fairly. We're also going to re-swatch the Marie's Professional Chinese colors when possible, because I think one of these colors is like, maybe not. I thought one of them was dead in the, there we go. There's the one that's dead in the tube, the Rouge. and it's also having an adverse chemical reaction to the tube that it's in. So that's exciting.
For this comparison test, we're using yet another sheet of our Blick cotton rag paper. I'm going to do 3 lines of black marker so that you guys have an opacity comparison point. And we are going to start out with our master level. Then we are going to go with our Marie's Economy. And then finally, we're going to end with the Marie's Professional paints. I'm using a silver black velvet round for these swatches, and I'm going to try to fit as many of these swatches as I can on the paper. We're doing a mass tone swatch, then we are doing a color gradient swatch, blending it out with clean water. I'm starting with the master level since that's what we're talking about today. And for the economy, I've also grabbed a small ceramic palette so that I have a surface that I can use to kind of integrate the colors in the water so we can be as fair as possible. With the older Western style Chinese watercolors, these come in ointment tubes in a pretty cheap plastic liner that's yellowing, and I'm not really sure how old these are. They might be 6 or even 7 years old. They are pretty dried out in the tubes. The colors themselves are very soft, they're not very saturated, and they're very pastel. I'm not sure if it's because the tubes are so dry and I'm just trying to get what paint I can, or if it's because they're weak. I unboxed and swatched these years ago, so if you guys are really curious, I will link that unboxing swatch down in the description below. Regardless though, I would recommend the master level watercolors over the economy watercolors. The economy watercolors are just not very good, and I would say they're probably a little bit below Reeves in terms of quality. So if you're looking for an affordable, cheap student grade watercolor, these are not the ones that I would recommend. In fact, I have a whole student grade showdown where I try out a bunch of different student grade watercolors if you're on the market for very economical watercolors. So these are the professional Chinese watercolors. I've had these for a while. They're in 9ml paint tubes in a flock lined gift box with magnetic closures. Try saying that 3 times fast. I'm reactivating them from some half pans that I dried them out in. The titanium white is just totally dried out. I tried to reconstitute it and was not successful. So I was able to reconstitute some of the half pans, but many are basically dust at this point, and it is difficult to get a saturated color, although it was easier to get saturated colors from these than from the Western watercolors we just swatched. I did try to refill some of these half pans, but most of the tubes have totally dried out. So far, it seems like master colors are brighter and more saturated with more granulation, with professional Chinese being the exception, but given how all these tubes fared over time, I'm not sure the master level tubes will really hold up in storage.
I was honestly kind of surprised by how many of these tubes in the Western and in the professional had just completely dried up, and how hard it was to reconstitute them enough to get some color out of them. Now, to be fair to both of these, I bought them like 2016. Like, they're almost 10 years old, but with quality watercolors, that shouldn't really make a big difference. Gum Arabic and honey are both fairly shelf stable, with honey being extremely shelf stable, and both of them are hydrophilic, so they want to absorb atmospheric moisture. For the professional, I can kind of understand why they might have trouble reconstituting. They may be animal hide glue based, or they may be gelatin based, and they just may give up the ghost after a while. Now, I did find that the master colors seem to be brighter, more saturated, more pigmented than the Western style Marie's, which is probably a student grade offering that is a little bit different from their Chinese student grade offering. and a little bit more saturated than the professional, although the professional Chinese does have some granulation due to how they mill these pigments, which is a really interesting process. Given though that both of these sets were stored in, look, I'll be real, they weren't always stored in the best conditions. There was a period right after Hurricane Ida where they were still at the house we were renting, and that house didn't have power for a month, and there was literally nothing we could do about that. So they were in some very hot and honestly kind of humid conditions. That said, otherwise they were always stored in climate controlled conditions, and who can help what a hurricane's gonna do? But it does make me kind of wonder if the master level tubes are gonna have some of the same problems that these seemingly student grade, and I would say lower end, comparable to Reeves student grade, and these professional might have. I did do a follow-up video like a couple years ago where I painted an illustration with these, and they weren't in the condition that they're in now. So they have been in a climate controlled area for the past 3 years, and they've still degraded some. So that's definitely something to keep in mind if you paint slower, if you don't use as much watercolor, if you paint little bitty illustrations. Basically, if you're not going through tubes every couple years, they may not hold up to the test of time. So I hesitate to say the master level is a better buy. I certainly do think it's a better buy than these here. Really not super impressed with these here. Although Marie's, like Reeves, do tend to be quite a bit cheaper than other watercolors on the market. But that's also kind of why I started doing all of these reviews in the first place, is to help you guys find watercolors and art supplies that are they're going to perform well, they're going to be able to deliver what you're looking for, but they're going to be affordable for you. And while I would normally recommend Mei-Liang pigments as an alternative to these any day of the week, I acknowledge you can go down to Jerry's and pick up a set of these right away, whereas you can't with the Mei-Liang pigments, although you can go to David's and pick up a set of the Mei-Liang pigments. So it all kind of depends on where you shop. But now it's time to put these to the field test and see how good they are, so we can talk about pros, cons, and decide on a verdict.
Before I start the field test, I'm going to make a palette map using a silver black velvet flat to just map out where all of the colors are in this palette so that it's easier to reference them. This illustration is on Arches Cold Press Cotton Rag watercolor paper. This is from Lilliputian Living 2023, I believe. The theme was animals. I have the second book of Lilliputian Living coming out, Les Petits Plaisirs de la Vie. So if you enjoy charming, tiny life, and if you like my illustrations, I hope you guys will check it out. So the first layer, I did a wet into wet bokeh effect. This is inspired by the bokeh effect that Sarah Cray taught in one of her kits, so kudos to her. I really enjoyed using it. It was actually pretty simple. It worked out pretty well with these paints and on this paper. The colors diffuse really nicely and softly, and they blend well into each other. I allowed that bokeh to mostly dry, and then I did another layer of bokeh, and I noticed no reactivation, which is good because I didn't want that. And I would notice that I was able to layer colors with these. So I decided maybe I would go for a third layer. I spritzed the palette before painting because the colors take a while to activate, like give them about 10 minutes to wake up. A lot of the paints came sort of loose in the pans, but there was no serious cracking. If you needed to, you could glue them back in using a little gum arabic. When painting the chicks, honestly, I'm kind of surprised how easy to work with these paints are. I really thought these would be awful out of the gate. Like, they're more transparent than I expected. You can sort of see the bokeh through the wet into wet I did on the chick. I'm also surprised by how much these will move wet into wet. I really figured they'd be very stiff and stodgy, like the Art Whale watercolors. So far, these are just nicer than the swatches had led me to believe. I believe I was worried that the neutrals would be weak or a mess. I'm starting with the neutrals with the chicks, and so far they're pretty great. So when painting the people, with the kids, I'm trying to do 3 different skin tones, which is a bit challenging as the neutrals really flatten out and desaturate when you add water, which is, natural when you're doing skin tones. I'll try letting these colors evaporate and saturate a bit more and then see if that helps. And I'm still kind of struggling with the skin tones as this progresses. I find that they're kind of weak. I'm really struggling to get a darker brown skin tone built up that doesn't flatten out or start to feel kind of like a zombie color. These would probably not be great for illustrators or comic artists who like to paint an array of people and need some of those colors to be more readily mixed. The girl in front, I decided to give her a pink, maybe a cream dress or a light purple dress, so a mix of ultramarine blue and magenta. For the boy, I was thinking about doing turquoise and phthalo or maybe an indigo. And for the girl in back, I was thinking of a green color palette with maybe orange and brown accents. So whenever I'm working on these kind of things, I actually take notes on how I want to handle it in addition to how the paints themselves handle it. So sometimes I'll read to you guys my notes because I think it might be interesting to get into another artist's head and think about how we think. I did notice it was kind of challenging to get multicolor mixes saturated enough. So when we have like 2 to 3 colors mixed together with some water, it desaturates pretty quickly. Now, that said, these are performing better than I expected, but they still don't beat the Mei pigments. I think these are better than the Art Whale tubes that I recently reviewed. They're certainly more versatile and can handle most applications from wet into wet to lifting. The only reason they're not quite as good as the Mei is that the mixes sort of fall apart. And for me, a watercolor comic artist and illustrator, these kind of secondary and tertiary color mixes are really important. It's really important for me to be able to dial in the colors that I want. I also noticed that these are a little bit more transparent than the Art Whale watercolors. Those were really opaque and kind of stodgy. I really, they have a lot of color to them, but they also have a lot of opacity to them. So I would say the Art Whale watercolors are not really a great fit if you want to do lighter and more delicate work. The Marie's Master Level watercolors worked really well for this. I was going for kind of a little golden book feel, and I feel like these watercolors really delivered on this. My biggest complaint is it's really important for me to be able to mix a variety of skin tones. Representing the diversity in life is really important and meaningful to me. I live in Southeast Louisiana. We have all kinds of people down here, and I want to paint what I see. And I found that this is just not really the best set for mixing up a variety of skin tones. It does already have a lot of colors available, and the chicks were absolutely not a problem at all. It was really easy to paint the chicks, but I was also going in with heavier saturations of color. I wasn't mixing with as much water. I wasn't trying to build up as many layers. So if you paint animals, this might be a better set for you. I also think if you paint flowers, this might be a better set. It's just not really the best fit if you want to paint a lot of people. It's a little bit more of a struggle. And I think I have talked about these are considered master level. And the reason for that is they're not necessarily professional grade. In the US, professional grade means a specific thing. And so they utilize the term artist grade or master level to kind of circumvent calling them professional level and having to have it at that standard. That said, I have noticed with brands that tend to have a master level or an artist level, those do tend to be better than their student grade watercolors. So I would place these somewhere in between student grade and a professional grade, probably closer to like a nice student grade than to a professional grade. To how transparent these are, usually I do have to do some re-inking when I do these field tests just to clean things up and clarify things, because when you paint on top of ink, sometimes the paint obscures the ink. I was kind of surprised that I didn't need to re-ink this piece.
we have finished field testing these watercolors, let's talk about the pros and cons of the Maries Masters watercolors. You start on a positive note. These set up well in half pans as dried watercolors. There wasn't a whole lot of cracking. There wasn't a lot of them just falling out of the pans. There wasn't a lot of debris. They stayed pretty solid. And if you give them a good amount of lead time for reactivation, like 5 minutes after spritzing, they reactivate decently well. They do take a little bit longer though. So let's talk about the cons. These are expensive if you don't buy them from the right source. So if you get them from the Marie source, or I guess I should say, scratch that, the cheaper source. I can't really vouch for you which one on Amazon is the right source and which one is the wrong source. So we're going to go with cheaper is maybe the right fit for you. If you get them from the official Marie's listing, they're $81.59. Oh my gosh. Fortunately, I did not pay that. If you get them from the Lightwish listing, and Lightwish also carries a lot of Arctic's products, they're $39.99, which is much more reasonable. And although the Marie's listing refers to these as a professional grade paint, and they don't necessarily call themselves professional grade, they call themselves master's level, I would definitely say these are more of a student grade paint than a professional grade. We're comparing these to Mei Liang. We're comparing these to Art Whale. These are not really a professional grade paint. And in that regard, they're pretty good for a student grade paint. Now, the secondary mixes tend to be kind of weak. I struggled to build up saturated colors from the secondary mixes even after evaporation, so it definitely has its limitations, but I felt like it handled wet into wet diffusion, lifting out for this bokeh effect really nicely. What is my verdict for the Marie's Master watercolors? I feel like there's really not that much to say about these. They're better than the Art Whale watercolors. I think, to be fair, the field tests are a little bit different. They were both done on arches, but for this one, I painted more skin tones. I tried to do a little bit more. The Art Whale one was really florals heavy. But these are not as good as my experiences with Mei Liang Pigment's watercolors. They're fine. They're not amazing, but they're not awful. I wouldn't pay more than $45 for them, but if you see them at a good price and you want to try a student grade watercolor that handles decently well, you might as well get the Mei Liang half pan. See, that is what's going to be the problem with student grade watercolors for me. I really like the Mei Liang watercolors. I'm kind of biased in their favor, not because we've worked together, not because they've paid me, not because we have any kind of a relationship, but because I use them pretty frequently and I really like them. I think they are a very solid student grade watercolor that can handle a lot of things that you would expect from a professional grade watercolor. So they've kind of set the bar for me, and it's really hard to compete with that. And I mean, I am trying other Chinese brands, both brands that call themselves a professional or master level, like the Art Whale / Superior and the Marie's Master that we're taking a look at here. And I'm still finding them kind of lacking. So it's kind of unfortunate that Mei Liang set the bar so high, but that's good news for you guys. It makes it easy for me to point you guys in a direction for a great student grade watercolor that is inexpensive and that you guys will be happy with. And it kind of like narrows your choices down. Like, to be fair, everything else for me lags far enough behind that it's not really a neck and neck competition. But if you have different experiences with these watercolors, if you feel differently, if you feel like they really are professional grade and I missed the mark, let me know down in the comments. This is just a review. It's just my opinion. I was not paid to give this opinion. In fact, I paid to give this opinion because I purchased these myself on Amazon using funds from my Patreon. If you like what I do and you'd like me to continue to do it, you can join me at patreon.com/natosoup. But, well, I lost track of what I was saying. ADHD. I paid for the privilege of reviewing these, but my opinion is still just an opinion, and opinions can differ, and people have different use cases for different art supplies. So if your use case is different from mine and you really like these for what you do, I would love to see what you do with these. So you feel free to let me know down in the comments. We're all here to help each other out.
So what are your thoughts on Marie's master level watercolors? Given all of the information that I provided you guys with, how do you feel about them? I found that they set up decently well in half pans, which makes them convenient to travel with, or if you are like me and you have a cat and you get cat hair all over your studio, it makes it convenient to shut the cat hair off. But I found that when compared to some of the other similarly priced, similar level of watercolors, they just don't hold up as well. They're just not as good as the Mei Liang pigments for me and for the kind of art that I like to make, but they are better than the Superior / Art Whale watercolors, especially for techniques like wet into wet. If you have used these watercolors and you have a different experience, you really like them, you really hate them, let me know down in the comments. But overall, I'm just kind of about these. It makes it hard to recommend them because they are not better than similarly priced watercolors, nor are they more common or more accessible. It's not like you're gonna see these at Walmart or at Michael's. So it's not like they can stand out in that way, but they're also not terrible. So there isn't necessarily a lot to really talk about. They're just kind of mediocre. And considering they are about as accessible as the Mei Liang and the Art Whale, that really doesn't give us a lot to say here today. Kind of a womp womp note to end on, but I hope that I was able to provide you with the information that you need to confidently buy or not buy these watercolors. So I hope you guys will check out some of my other reviews to get more information, especially if you're on the market for student grade watercolors and you only want to buy once, you don't want to waste your money trying a bunch of different things. Check out some of the other reviews that I'm going to have in the cards, and then I'm going to have linked down in the description below. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again soon with another art supply review, tutorial, or artist chat.